Hello, friends. I'm Emma. Do you exercise once a year for 10 hours? No. You exercise a little every day. Learning English is the same. Just 17 minutes a day builds incredible confidence. Today, I will show you how 17 minutes of daily English practice transforms your confidence forever. Let me ask you something. Do you know someone who speaks English with confidence? They look relaxed. They smile when they speak. They are not afraid of mistakes. How did they become so confident? The secret is not talent. The secret is not luck. The secret is daily practice. Small practice every day builds big confidence. Think about this. You don't become strong by lifting weights once a month for 5 hours. You become strong by exercising a little every day. English confidence works the same way. I learned this lesson myself. 5 years ago, I was afraid to speak English. I knew grammar rules, I knew vocabulary, but I had no confidence. I felt nervous in every conversation. Then I discovered the power of daily practice. I started practicing just 15 minutes every day. Something amazing happened. After 1 week, I felt more confident. After 1 month, I started enjoying conversations. After 3 months, I became the confident English speaker I always wanted to be. Today, I will teach you my 17-minute confidence system. This system changed my life, it changed my students' lives, and it will change your life too. Are you ready to build unshakable English confidence? Let's begin this journey together. Let me explain why daily practice is so powerful for confidence. There are 3 important reasons. Reason number 1, your brain learns to trust itself. When you practice English every day, your brain starts to believe, I can do this. Every day you practice, you prove to yourself that you are capable. Every small success builds more confidence. Think about walking. When you were a baby, you fell many times, but you tried again every day. Now you walk without thinking. You trust your legs completely. English confidence works the same way. Reason number 2. Practice makes speaking automatic. At first, speaking English is difficult. You think about every word. You translate in your head. You worry about grammar. This makes you feel nervous and slow. But when you practice every day, something amazing happens. Your mouth learns what to say. Words come naturally. You stop thinking so much. You start flowing. When speaking becomes automatic, you feel free. You feel confident. You enjoy conversations instead of worrying about them. Number 3, daily success creates positive feelings. Every day you practice English, you accomplish something. You feel proud. You feel good about yourself. These positive feelings grow stronger every day. Soon, you start to think, I am someone who speaks English well. This becomes part of who you are. This is true confidence. It comes from inside, not from outside. The magic of 17 minutes. You might ask, Emma, why 17 minutes? Why not 15 or 20? I discovered that 17 minutes is perfect. It is not too short and not too long. It is enough time to practice well, but not enough time to feel tired. When you tell yourself, I will practice for 17 minutes, it feels possible. You can find 17 minutes in any day.
But 17 minutes is also enough time to do real practice that builds real confidence. Remember this, a little every day is better than a lot once a week. Confidence grows slowly but steadily, like a plant growing toward the sun.
Now let me teach you exactly what to do in your 17 minutes. I will give you 5 confidence-building activities. You can choose one activity each day. Activity 1. Confident listening. Listen to English with confidence as your goal. Don't just listen to understand. Listen to feel comfortable with English sounds. Choose something for your level. It can be a simple podcast, a short story, or easy conversations. The most important thing is this. Don't worry about understanding every word. Here is how to do confident listening. First, sit comfortably. Relax your body. Tell yourself, I am learning and growing. Second, listen without stopping. Don't pause to look up words. Don't replay difficult parts. Just let the English flow into your ears. Third, focus on what you do understand. Maybe you understand 30%. That is good. Maybe you understand 50%. That is great. Feel proud of what you understand. After 17 minutes, ask yourself, how do I feel? If you feel calm and relaxed, you are building confidence. This is more important than understanding every word. Do this every day. Soon, English will sound familiar and friendly, not scary. Activity 2. Confidence speaking practice. This is my favorite activity. You will practice speaking with confidence even when you are alone. Choose a simple topic. Your day, your family, your hobbies, your dreams. Set a timer for 17 minutes. Start talking about your topic out loud. Yes, out loud. Use your real voice. Don't stop to think about grammar. Don't stop to find perfect words. Just keep talking. If you make a mistake, continue. The goal is not perfect English. The goal is confident English. Here are some topic ideas. My perfect day would be, the thing I love most is, my favorite memory is. Start simple. Use short sentences. The more you practice, the more confident you will feel. Activity 3. Confidence reading. Read English materials for 17 minutes. Choose something interesting and easy. A short story. Simple news. A blog about your hobby. Here is the method. First, read the title and think, this will be interesting. Start with a positive attitude. Second, read slowly. Don't rush. Enjoy each sentence. If you see a new word, try to guess the meaning. Third, don't use a dictionary too much. Only look up very important words. After reading, think about what you learned. Maybe you learned new words. Maybe you understood a new idea. All of these build confidence. Activity 4. Confidence writing. Writing builds confidence because you can see your thoughts in English. Write for 17 minutes about positive things. Write about your successes. Write about your dreams. For example, today I learned, I am proud of myself because my English is getting better because
Don't worry about perfect grammar. Write like you are talking to a good friend. After 17 minutes, read what you wrote. Feel proud of yourself. You just expressed yourself in English. Activity 5. Confidence shadowing. Shadowing means you repeat what you hear immediately. This builds speaking confidence very quickly. Choose clear audio that is not too fast. Listen to one sentence, then repeat the sentence immediately. Try to copy the rhythm and sound. Do this again and again. Listen, repeat, listen, repeat. Focus on feeling confident while you speak. Stand up straight. Speak clearly. This trains your mouth and your mind at the same time. You learn how English should sound. Let me show you exactly what happens when you practice for 17 minutes every day. After one day, you feel proud. You think, I did something good for myself today. Maybe you understand one new word. Maybe you say one sentence more clearly. It is small, but it is real progress. Most importantly, you feel hopeful. You think, if I can do this today, I can do this tomorrow too. After 1 week, something beautiful starts to happen. English starts to feel familiar. You are not as nervous when you hear English. You start to recognize common words and phrases. You begin to think, maybe I can do this. This is the beginning of real confidence. Your brain starts to believe in your abilities. After 1 month, this is when the magic really happens. You notice that you understand more English naturally. You don't translate every word in your head. You start to think in English sometimes. Your speaking becomes smoother. Words come more easily. You make fewer pauses when you speak. Most importantly, you start to feel like, I am someone who can speak English. This identity change is the foundation of lasting confidence. After 3 months, by now, English confidence is part of who you are. You look forward to English conversations. You volunteer to speak in English when you have the chance. People notice your confidence. They see that you enjoy speaking in English. They want to practice with you. You realize that mistakes don't scare you anymore. You know that mistakes are part of learning, not signs of failure. This is the power of daily practice. Small steps every day create big changes over time. Now, let me help you stay consistent with your 17-minute practice. These tips will make daily practice easy and enjoyable. Tip 1. Choose your best time. Pick one time of day for your English practice. Some people like morning practice. They feel fresh and ready to learn. Some people like evening practice. It helps them relax. Choose the time that feels right for you. Then practice at the same time every day. This makes it become a habit, like brushing your teeth. Tip 2. Prepare everything in advance. Before you go to bed, prepare for tomorrow's practice. Save a podcast on your phone. Open a story on your computer. Put your notebook and pen on your desk. When everything is ready, it is easy to start. When you have to search for materials, it is easy to give up. Tip 3. Track your confidence. Keep a simple journal. Every day after practice, write one sentence. Today, I felt. Write how confident you felt during practice. Write what made you feel good. This helps you see your confidence growing over time. Tip 4. Celebrate small wins. Every time you complete your 17 minutes, celebrate. Say, "Well done" to yourself. Feel proud of your commitment. Maybe you can check a box on a calendar. Maybe you can tell a friend about your practice. Maybe you can do something small that makes you happy. Tip 5. Be kind to yourself. Some days will be easier than others. Some days you will feel very confident. Some days you might feel frustrated. This is normal. This is part of learning. Don't be hard on yourself on difficult days. Just try again tomorrow. Remember, consistency is more important than perfection. Showing up every day is more important than having perfect practice sessions.
My dear friends, you now have everything you need to build unshakable English confidence. You understand why daily practice works. You know exactly what to do in your 17 minutes. You have practical tips to stay consistent. You have a clear timeline of how your confidence will grow. But the most important thing I want you to remember is this. You already have everything inside you to succeed. You just need to practice consistently to let that confidence shine. Think of confidence like a muscle. Every day you practice, that muscle gets stronger. Every day you use English, you become more confident. Remember my story. 5 years ago, I was afraid to speak English. Today, I am teaching you with confidence. The only difference is daily practice and belief in my ability to improve. You can do the same thing. You have the same potential. You have the same ability to grow. Starting tomorrow, commit to 17 minutes of English practice every day for 30 days. Choose one of the 5 activities I taught you today. After 30 days, you will be amazed at how much your confidence has grown. You will speak with more ease. You will feel more comfortable. You will enjoy English more. Most importantly, you will believe in yourself more. Every confident English speaker started exactly where you are now. They felt nervous. They made mistakes. They had doubts. But they kept practicing. They stayed consistent. They believed in their ability to improve. You can do the same thing. You have the same potential. You have the same ability to grow. Starting tomorrow, commit to 17 minutes of English practice every day for 30 days. Choose one of the 5 activities I taught you today. After 30 days, you will be amazed at how much your confidence has grown. You will speak with more ease. You will feel more comfortable. You will enjoy English more. Most importantly, you will believe in yourself more. Every confident English speaker started exactly where you are now. They felt nervous. They made mistakes. They had doubts. But they kept practicing. They stayed consistent. They believed in their ability to improve. You can do the same thing. Your confident English-speaking future is waiting for you. All you have to do is take one small step today. This is Soundline English Podcast. I'm Emma. Thank you for choosing to build your confidence with me today. Keep practicing, keep believing, keep growing. Your confidence is growing stronger every single day. See you in the next episode. Goodbye for now, my confident English friends.